Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on social media and wherever you listen to podcasts. This episode is supported by our Patreon supporters and by Monkey Business. Tonight, we'll read some selected Himalayan folk tales from a 1906 book called Simla Village Tales, written by Alice Elizabeth Draycott. From the author in her preface. Himalayan folklore, with its beauty, wit, and mysticism, is a most fascinating study and makes one grieve to think that the day is fast approaching when the honest, rugged hill folk of northern India will lose their fireside tales under the influence of modern civilization. From their cradle under the shade of ancient cedars, beside the rocks, forests, and streams of the mighty Himalayan mountains, have I sought these tales to place them upon the great bookshelf of the world. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. The monkey, the tiger, and the princess. Once upon a time, there was a king who had 7 sons, and he made up his mind that he would not let them marry unless they married 7 sisters. So he sent his Brahmin to seek a Raja who had 7 daughters, and to bring him word. After a time, the Brahmin succeeded, and found a Raja who had 7 daughters. So arrangements were speedily made for their marriage. When the time came for the 7 princes to go and fetch their brides, the youngest said to his father, "If we all go, who is to look after the house and all your property? Let me remain behind, and when my brothers return with their wives, they can bring my bride also." His father thought this a very wise suggestion, so they set out, leaving the youngest brother at home. After the wedding festivities were over, the 7 brides were carried along in doolies, with the 6 princes for an escort, and they halted for the night near a tank or pond in the forest, but did not know that the place was full of tigers. At night, the tigers formed a ring round the camp, and said they would eat every one in it unless one of the princesses was given up to them. None of the 6 princes would give up his wife. At last, they decided to leave the 7th princess to the tigers. When the procession arrived at the Raja's palace, the youngest prince wondered why only 6 doolies had come, and asked what had become of his bride, but nobody would give him an answer. At last, an old man told him what had happened, and the young prince, who was very angry and disappointed with his brothers, at once set out to seek his bride. On the way, he met a rat and a jackal, and they said, "May we go with you?" The prince consented, and the 3 set out together and walked or rode till evening, when they were overcome with fatigue and sat down to rest. The prince fell asleep, but the jackal said to the rat, "I'm very hungry. What shall we do for food? Do you eat the prince's clothes, and I will eat his horse." No sooner did they agree that they carried out their plan. The rat ate all the clothes worn by the prince, and the jackal ate his horse, so that when he awoke, it was to find himself alone in the forest without either horse or clothes. Just then, a monkey came down from the tree and asked him what was the matter. "I have told my troubles to 2 animals before, and do not wish to be betrayed by a third," said the prince. To which the monkey replied, "A rat is a rat, and a jackal is a jackal, but I am a monkey. Come with me, and I will help you out of your troubles." Then they went to the bazaar, where the monkey gave his friend the prince some money and told him to buy himself clothes. When he had bought the clothes, he gave him some more money and said to buy himself a sword and ornaments, and lastly, to buy himself a horse. And the monkey advised that it should be a thin horse, fleet of limb. Then the 2 mounted the horse and rode into the forest, where they soon found the princess sitting tied up in a den, with an old blind tiger in charge of her. The blind tiger held 2 strings. One was attached to the girl, and the other to a large tiger who had gone out with the rest of the tigers, but who, at the slightest pull of the string, was ready to return to give any assistance required of him. The monkey whispered to the girl to try and free herself, and meantime he began to sweep the room and busy himself, so that the old blind tiger might think the girl was busy at her household work. After a time, the girl managed to get away, and she fled with the prince, until the monkey thought they were at a safe distance. Then he turned round and dealt several blows to the old blind tiger, who, in her turn, pulled the string. A great big tiger at once came to her assistance and asked what had happened. But he was enraged to find the girl had gone, and beat the old tiger soundly before setting off in hot pursuit. On the way, he saw a man, who was in reality the monkey in disguise, sitting beside a funeral pyre. "What is that for?" asked the tiger. "A certain tiger," said the monkey, "has killed his mother today, and this is to burn her upon." The tiger felt remorse, for he had not meant to kill the old tiger, so he rushed back to the den, and this gave the fugitives time to escape yet further. But when the tiger found his mother alive and well, he was so angry that he dragged her out of the den by her feet and threw her on the ground. Then he ran back to where the monkey was sitting and found him still busy with the funeral pyre, for he said that an old woman had been dragged out by her feet that day, and she was even now being carried to be burnt. The tiger was filled with remorse at what he had done, and for a second time ran back to the den. By this time, both the prince and the princess had escaped in safety, and the monkey joined them. They were always good to him, but he pined for the woods and the forests. Yet, whenever he asked to be allowed to return, they would not allow it. So one day he determined to make the princess so angry that she would herself turn him out. He awaited his opportunity and broke all the thread as she was spinning. The princess threw something heavy at his head, and he feigned to fall down dead. Great were the lamentations over the faithful monkey, and he was carried in solemn ceremony to be burnt, just as though he were a Raja's son. but the moment they laid him upon the fire, up he jumped and ran off. The princess scolded him for causing her such sorrow, but he explained that since there was no other way of getting back into the forest and regaining his liberty, he had thought this the best way. Then they all came home and let the monkey sport in the forest as before. The story of Puran. There was once a shoemaker who had a vegetable garden in which grew a bed of eggplant. Unknown to him, a fairy used sometimes to come and walk there, and one day, while passing the eggplant bushes, a thorn on them caught one of her wings and broke it, so she was unable to fly and had to remain where she was. Next time the shoemaker visited his garden, he saw a beautiful woman in it. Not knowing that she was a fairy, asked her to tell him her name and how she came there. Her only reply was, "I am cold. Give me a covering, I pray you." Then he invited her to take shelter in his hut and gave her a warm covering, saying, "Take this and stay as long as you like and be my daughter." The shoemaker had a kind heart and was very good to his adopted child, whom he named Lunar Chumari. Now a Raja, by name Suleiman, sometimes visited the shoemaker's shop, and when he saw the fairy, he fell in love with her and begged for her hand in marriage. The shoemaker consented, and after a time the marriage took place. But Suleiman had another wife at his palace, and a son whose name was Puran, and he was most anxious to find out whether, when he grew up, this son would make a good ruler. So he sent for a Brahmin and inquired. "Yes," declared the Brahmin, "he will be a good ruler, but you must keep him locked up for 12 years in an underground room." This was done, and at the time when Suleiman met the fairy, the 12 years had nearly been completed. But the boy refused to remain even a week longer, for he was weary of being locked up for so long. Even his own mother could not influence him in the matter, and so he was released. Now Puran was a very comely youth, and when he made his obeisance to his new stepmother, she was greatly impressed with his handsome face, and thought to herself, "Had I not been in such a hurry, I might have married him instead of Suleiman." The thought vexed her so much that she made up her mind to get Puran out of her sight by having him killed. She told Suleiman that his boy was wanting in respect towards her and deserving of death. On hearing this, Suleiman had a bowl of boiling oil prepared and, calling his son, said, "My son, if this be indeed true about you, plunge your hand into this boiling oil. If you are innocent, no harm will come to you." Puran, without a sign of fear, did as his father bid him, and plunged in his hand, taking it out without a remark. Then Suleiman turned to his wife and said, "See, the oil does not burn him." But she replied angrily, "Never mind, I'm not content, and shall not rest day or night until you have his eyes put out, and both his hands and his feet cut off, after which you must have him flung into a pit." Suleiman, who was completely under the power of the fairy, at last consented to this, and gave the order. But Puran's own mother pleaded so earnestly that her boy's eyes might be spared, that the servants felt sorry for her, and, substituting the eyes of an animal, they left the young man's eyes untouched. Then Puran was thrown into a pit and left there. A guru or priest who lived near that place used to send his followers daily to bring food and water for him, and one of them, mistaking the dry pit for a well, let down his chatty for water, whereupon Puran, whose hands and feet had been restored by the Almighty, caught hold of the chatty and would not let go. The Guru called out, "Let go, or I will bring my book of incantations and crush you into the dust." "Try," replied a voice from the bottom of the pit, "for I too can bring my books and crush you to dust." The Guru was frightened, and, returning to the head Guru, his master, told him what had happened. Then the old Guru said, "It must be Puran. I will go and see." So, taking with him a ball of raw cotton, he called out at the top of the pit, "Puran, is that you? If so, and you are an innocent man, I will let down a thread of raw cotton, and you will be able to climb up by it, for it will not break if used by the innocent." "Let it down," replied Puran, and he climbed up safely. The Guru looked at him as he stood up, and then quietly returned to his own home. There he met all his followers, who are called chelas, and sent them out to bring stores. There were 135 chelas, and before they left, he warned them, saying, "Go everywhere except to that magic country where those women live who practice witchcraft." But the men were curious and, in spite of the warning, went to the witches' country. The witches saw them coming and laughed gleefully. "Let us play a trick on these young gurus," they said, "and turn them all into young bulls." This they did, and leading the creatures to their husbands, said, "See what fine bulls we have brought in exchange for 2.5 pounds of flour." The husbands were very pleased and kept the bulls to carry loads. Meanwhile, the old Guru waited for his followers, but as none of them appeared, he sought the aid of his books and discovered what had happened. Then he pronounced his incantations and dried up all the water in the country, with the exception of one well, near which he sat. The witches soon found that they would die of thirst, so they came to the old man's well, but they barely had time to put down their chatties before he turned the lot of them into donkeys and let them graze. Very soon the witches were missed by their husbands, who came to the old Guru and asked if he could give them any news. "How can I tell," said he, "when 135 of my own gurus are lost, and I cannot find them?" "But you can recall them, our father," said the men. "That is what I meant to do." And so saying, the Guru took out his books and began to read. While he did this, they saw in the distance a herd of 135 bulls approaching, and each one carried a load of wood or hay. They stood still before the old Guru, who then restored them to their former shapes. Then the witches' husbands were amazed and said, "Oh, Guru, can you not call our wives also?" "Call them yourselves, my friends, as you have seen me call my men." But the men knew nothing of either witchcraft or incantations, so they besought the Guru to help them. At last he agreed, and asked for a thick, strong stick, which he gave into the hands of one of his chelas, and said, "Go knock each of these donkeys a blow on the head with this." The chela did as he was told, and the donkeys resumed the shapes of women, all but 5 old ones, which the Guru said must remain donkeys by way of warning. Then the Guru sent his followers forth as before, and coming to the pit where Puran had been found, they saw a dry stick standing near it. "This will do for fire," said they. But when they touched it, a feeble voice was heard. So they reported the matter to the old guru, and when he touched the stick, it said, "Guruji." On this he recognized Puran, who for years had waited beside the well. "Why did you not go home, my son?" "Because you did not tell me," said Puran, "so I waited here for your orders." Then the guru held him tenderly and washed the mud off him, and in many days he grew strong again. "Now, go home to your parents," said the guru. But Puran said, "No, I will remain with you." Thus in time, he became a very highly respected guru. The story of ghosts. There was once a Rani, or Raja's wife, who had no children, so she made a great pet of a young squirrel and fed it day after day. One day it entered her head to deceive the Raja, so she told him that, before the end of the year, an heir would be born in the palace. On the appointed day, she sent her own nurse, whom she had bribed, to tell the Raja that the child was born and was a daughter. The old Brahmin of the palace hastened to see the young princess, who was, in reality, no child, but the tame squirrel. So the Rani persuaded him to go and tell the Raja that he was now the father of a most lovely daughter. But the stars pointed out that he must not look on her face for 12 years, for, if she looked at him, he would die, and if he looked at her, she would die. The poor Raja had no choice but to agree, and thus the Rani kept up her deception for 12 years and hid her pet squirrel from everybody. At last, when the 12 years were over, she said one day to her husband, "Do not look upon your daughter's face till she is married, lest evil come upon her, but go you and make arrangements to marry her to a prince of a good family." So they sent the old Brahmin to seek for a husband for her, and he went from palace to palace until he came to a city where there was a Raja who had 7 sons, all of whom were married but the youngest, whose name was Shahzada. So the Brahmin chose him, and all was prepared for the marriage. There was a great feast held, and great rejoicings daily took place in the palace. When at last the dooli came for the bride to be carried to her home, the Rani hid the squirrel inside it, and nobody guessed that there was in reality no bride. On reaching his home, the young bridegroom had the dooli placed at the door of his zenana, according to their custom, so that none might see the bride enter, and great indeed was his surprise when he looked inside to find nobody there but a squirrel. For very shame he held his peace and told nobody of it, but gave orders in the palace that he and his wife would live apart by themselves, and she would be in such strict purdah that even the women of the household would not be allowed to visit her. This gave great offense to everybody, but they put it down to his jealousy, owing to his wife's great beauty, and obeyed. At last, his other brother's wife rebelled and said, "I refuse to do all the household work. Your wife must also take her share in it." Shahzada was now very sad, for he felt the time had come for his secret to be discovered, and he would become the laughingstock of the whole palace. The squirrel, who was a great favorite of his, noticed his sadness and asked him the cause of it. "Why are you sad, O prince?" "I'm sad because They say you must do some household work, and how are you to do it, being only a squirrel?" "What is it they want me to do?" "To plaster the floor." "Well, tell them to do their own portion of the work, and leave me mine to do at my leisure." This was done, and at night the squirrel went and dipped her tail into the lime wash and plaster, and soon had the room better done than the other Ranis. In the morning all the household were surprised to see the clever way in which Shahzada's wife had done her work, and they said, "No wonder you hide your wife when she is so clever." The next day the task was to grind some corn, and again Shahzada's heart was heavy, for how could a squirrel turn a heavy stone hand mill and grind corn? But the squirrel said as before, "Tell them to do their work, and to leave mine alone. I will do it when I've finished my bath." When night came, she went into the room, and with her sharp little teeth, cutter, 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 soon reduced the corn to powder. Shahzadah was very pleased with her, and so were they all, and nothing more was said until the next day, when the allotted task was to make a native dish called gulgulas. This is done by mixing gur or molasses with flour and water and frying it in ghee like fritters. The poor little squirrel was indeed at her wit's end how to perform the task, for how could so small an animal make so difficult a dish? She tried and she tried, but failed each time in her attempts until it was nearly morning. Just then the god Mahadeo and his wife Parbati were taking a walk in the dawning light of day. Parbati saw the poor little squirrel's efforts and said to Mahadeo, "I will not rest content till you turn that small creature into a human being so that she can perform her task." At first Mahadeo refused, but after a time he took out a knife and, making a cut in his finger, took the blood from it and sprinkled it upon the squirrel, who forthwith turned into a most beautiful princess. Just then, as she sat finishing her task, other members of the royal family awoke and came in. They were greatly amazed at her beauty and led her by the hand to their own apartments. Meantime, Shahzadah, her husband, was stricken with grief, thinking his poor little squirrel had been burnt to death. He sought her everywhere, and when he could not find her, began to cry, "Oh, my ghost, where are you?" The woman standing there scolded him for this and said, "Why do you call your beautiful wife a young squirrel? She is not dead, but has at last been found by us, and is with the other princesses in the palace." But Shahzadah, who knew nothing of what had happened, only wept the more, for he thought they were making fun of him. So he went to his own room, where he flung himself on his couch and continued to weep. At last, he looked up and saw, standing beside him, a beautiful girl who said, "Do not weep, O prince, for I am your squirrel." Then she told him all that had happened. This was indeed good news, and it was not long before the grateful princess wrote to her foster mother, who had been so good and kind to her when she was only a helpless little creature, and invited her and her father, the Rajah, to come on a visit. This was the first time the Rajah had seen or kissed his daughter, and he was indeed pleased to find she was so beautiful. So there were great rejoicings in the palace, and they all lived happily ever after.